So again, as I begin every class, I want to thank you for running the marathon with me. I have a couple of announcements today before we introduce our student speakers. Today, Ihor will present on Andrei Portnov and the future of Ukrainian studies after Maidan. So Portnov, who is from Dnipro, he's now in Berlin, working on many interesting projects, including on transregionalism and Prisma Ukraina. We'll also have today Alex Sadlova, who will present about Marlene Laruelle, a work that Laruelle co-authored. She's one of the most important political geographers and geopolitical thinkers, originally from Paris, now teaching in the United States at George Washington University. And we'll also have on Friday a couple of different tasks. So I suspect that we probably won't get through everything today because I will present some of my work from Mapping Europe's Borderlands, Ukraine Under Western Eyes, Mapmen, this lovely book that I already wrote and spoke about at Kharkiv today. Jim Baker will be our last speaker, and he'll talk on Friday about Sumati Ramaswamy, who is one of the most interesting professors in the humanities. She teaches in the US at Duke University, one of the leading thinkers in not just, say, cartography or visual arts or gender and history, but also, I think, really interesting as a commenter on the future of post-colonial studies and post-colonial scholarship. I would also like, on the last day, to have an informal conversation with you, a kind of capstone conversation. And my proposal to you is to do this. By the end of class today, I would like to have from each of you a paper with your name on it, with one or two questions about Borderlands. So they could be academic questions, they could be activist questions, they could be questions about individual writers and scholars and authors, but this is a way for us to hold a final conversation because you've been absorbing so much information from so many different disciplines, from cultural history, from political geography, from sociology. So before the end of class today, while you're listening to me and listening to the other speakers, I'd like you to think about one or two big questions from the last 2 weeks, combining your knowledge, combining the reading that you did for Mayhill, for me, and for Tomasz. I think this will be a way for us to think very carefully about whether or not Borderlands is useful at all, really. If it's just an ideology, if it's just an excuse for a conversation, if it's just a form of liberal multiculti brainwashing, the CIA is really good at that. But I want you to think very carefully about, let's say, the next decade, the 2020s, after the election in Poland, after the election in the United States. This is a crucial election in the United States. If Trump is elected, California might secede from the Union. I'm not joking. There are actual possibilities which we have only begun to think about, and scales of violence which we have only begun to think about. Not to exaggerate, but empires fall. And really, I think there's one left standing. There are several others in the waiting. So I want you to think very carefully about the potential for Borderlands, because in times of war and revolution, I made this point on the very first day, all lands become borderlands. Whether you live in a city or a village or a town, your place is a borderland. There is no place to hide and no place to avoid making the kind of choices that we discussed last time in looking at biography, life history, the debate, as it were, between Marcy Shore and Kate Brown, not just over the Ukrainian Revolution and Maidan, but over the world after Maidan, or the world after a revolution, any revolution, or revolutions, to quote A.J.P. Taylor, the great historian of the Habsburg Empire, revolution of 1848, a point that did not turn, right? Where history did not turn, where what was expected did not happen. Okay, so I want to invite first Ihor to come and talk about Andrei Portnov and the future of Ukrainian studies after 2014.
Good morning to everyone. As you know, my name is Ihor, and I think that it even better that I have presentation today, because the theme of my article is not deeply connected with, for example, biographies of participants of Maidan or anthropological dimension of it. So the article I've picked is an article of Andrei Portnov, Ukrainian historian, well-known Ukrainian historian. We actually in Ukraine have another guy with the same surname and even patronymic, and it's a very odious and infamous Ukrainian politician, but as you can guess, I'm not gonna speak about this guy a lot. No, I'm kidding. I'm not gonna speak about him at all. So my article is called Post-Maidan Europe and the New Ukrainian Studies by Andrei Portnov, and it was published in Slavic Review in 2015. But first of all, I would like to show the next slide.
Do it on this. Sorry, this.
Thank you. I would like to say a few words about the author. Historian Andrei Portnov was born in 1979, and now he works as a professor of history of Ukraine at the Viadrina European University in Frankfurt on Oder in Germany, and also he is director of the East European Research Network and author of 6 books and more than 200 publications in different languages. He was one of chief funders of historians in UA, Ukraina Moderna, and others very interesting internet sources for researchers. And actually, in general, about what is this article about? In general, this article is devoted to the seeking of ways of replacement, reductive historicization with responsible contextualization. In particular, it about some Portnov's proposals for a new Ukrainian studies or for a new program of Ukrainian studies in a transnational and global perspective. Why it is so important for humanitarians or for humanitarian sciences? Because according to Portnov, the academic and public debate around the Ukraine crisis has highlighted a number of problems which are connected with the field of researchers in Russia, in East European studies, and these problems deal with the narrative, mostly historical myth, and rights of post-Soviet states to have their own history. As we already mentioned, actually I should to say that the article is derived into several parts. Text of this article consists of 3 parts, 3 little chapters. First of it is Ukraine and Balkanization talk. Second, identity versus violence. And the last one is imagining the new Ukrainian studies. In addition to these 3 chapters, there is an introduction in which Portnoy mentioned Mark von Hagen article, Does Ukraine Have a History? And he said that his question sounds no less relevant nowadays. But according to Portnoy, complicated recent events, usually called the Ukrainian crisis, revealed, among other things, of course, the strength of historical stereotypes and conventional categories of explanations. And due to his article, we can know that, for example, Ukraine crisis is often portrayed as an apple of discord, or in other words, as a battlefield between superpowers in, for example, Europe or United States or Russia. Of course, Portnoy, as a Ukrainian, probably don't like such way of thinking, and he against stereotypes. Portnoy argued that the relations between Ukrainians and Russians, especially Ukrainian speakers versus Russian speakers in Donbass, is still considered by many as the main line of conflict, which actually lead to the war situation in Donbass. But he said that such an attitude comfortably reduces the problem to essentialized categories of nation, intimately linked to language and nationalism, and invokes false comparison to, for example, post-communist Yugoslavia or communist Czechoslovakia. He said that in this intellectual scheme we don't have a place, for example, to Russian-speaking Ukrainian nationalist. So, in his opinion, he said that he isn't trying to postulate the lack of any language-related problems or conflicts in Ukraine. Of course, they exist, but rather his point was that the division within Ukraine or within Ukrainian society cannot be reduced only to national related or national language related issue. And in other words, Portnoy considered that there is no direct correlation between the preferred language. He actually speaks also about distinguish between preferred language and mother tongue. He said that is complete, very often is complete, slightly different things. And he said that there are many other split factors, such factors like religious life, because we in Ukraine have a variety of different churches. And the second thing is historical narratives. For example, how to correct to say, do we have, for example, the Great Patriotic War or World War II in the Ukrainian territory? In his second part, also I would like to add also a political issue, especially after our recent elections, which in my opinion is very connected with two previous factors, for example, with religion and with historical narrative rhetorics. So, in his second part, Identity versus Violence, Portnoy tried to trace trajectories development of Donetsk and Crimea crisis in comparison with Dnipropetrovsk. I wouldn't reconstruct the whole chronology of the events. If you're interested in, you can read, of course, but instead of it I will use an example which Portnoy mentioned and by which Portnoy or was trying to illustrate his conclusion. It was a case of Dnipropetrovsk, where conditions were very similar to Donbass, but a choice which was made was slightly different. I'm gonna also skip different details about Kolomoisky and his attitude and his influence on salvation of Dnipropetrovsk and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast from Ruski Mir. But more importantly, as I think, that Portnoy assumes that the category of identity matters and mattered in Ukrainian crisis and in war on Donbass. Mattered, of course, but hasn't crucial importance. So identity, of course, plays its own role, but the border with Russia or, for example, position of local elites or some other significant factors can be more significant, can be more important. Last part of his article deals with issues of imagining the new Ukrainian studies, and Portnoy concurred with Ilya Gerasimov, that the chief or executive editor of Ab Imperio, that we simply lack already analytical language and explanatory models to describe the new Ukraine as a unique and, yes, unprecedented phenomenon. So he concurred with opinion of Gerasimov, and he said that if we want to define the nature of post-Maidan Ukraine with all these contradictions, for example, with pro-democratic political movement that was not directly linked of economic growth, or with a political nation with two different languages, with numerous churches and other factors, with, for example, diverse memories, we have to invent new heuristic approach. And he thinks that three ways, I call it this way, of the new Ukrainian studies, or three forces which that could, for example, reinforce Ukrainian studies, is three things. For example, oriented Ukrainian studies could be imagined and as inclusive in three ways: oriented toward the interaction between Russian, Polish, Jewish, and Ottoman studies, envision it as a fundamentally interdisciplinary research field in which history meets anthropology, economics, sociology, literary studies, political philosophy, and art history. And the last one, openly disposed to researchers from Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, involving people from the various provinces rather than focusing on the capital cities only, who are still underrepresented in international debates and exchange programs. And Portnoy finished his article by very, I would like to say, optimistic withdrawal. Ukraine is an extremely fascinating subject with no proper analytical language to describe it. And development of Ukrainian studies could bring important insights into the comparative and entangled research on violence, identification, hybridity, economic infrastructure, situational nationalism, and situational bilingualism. It could also introduce a better dynamic to the field of Eastern European and Slavic studies, show the limits of the intellectual temptation to explain the current conflicts and reincarnations of old ones, and help replace reductive historicization with responsible contextualization. So we can see also not particular but general part of his article. That's all. Thank you.
So let's talk about this. Ihor, why is it optimistic? Why do you think Portnoy is being optimistic about this?
Because I think that he a little bit overestimated maybe not a significance of new Ukrainian studies, but the way of its development. That is why I consider that him is a little optimistic.
Okay. Questions from the audience? I'm sure there has to be some questions. Go ahead, Ilya, please.
So I'm just obliged to because excuse me, it's wired. And first of all, this is visibly that he never studied the region, but I know the reason why he thinks that he is an expert and he could be participating in discussions. Because you know he criticized this approach to reduce identity to language and ethnicity, for example. But he himself reduces this discussion towards language to the language and ethnicity when he compares Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region, for example. But actually, if you really study the region, you understand that local identity is first of all is about miners' cult and about mafia wars in 1990s. It's language and ethnicity is just visible markers which are usually used, but it's not identity. It's just one minor part of it. But
right.
Here's the passage. I just love it.
Go ahead, please read.
Because he uses this. He cites this survey of Ukraine Moderna, and he says that there was so many researchers, as he says, use this survey as well. And in this survey, inhabitants of Donetsk in 1994, they replied that they are Soviets. First of all, they feel that they are Soviet people. But it's like a cheating because he doesn't describe the rest of the survey because there are 3 stages in 1994, if I'm not mistaken, 1999 and 2004. And in 2004, more than 40% of Donetsk inhabitants said that, first of all, primary, they feel that they are Donetsk person, and then they are Ukrainians or something like this. But the final part of this paragraph, and when he cites this part of this survey, I just need to cite this.
Go ahead, please.
So it also reduces the regional specifics to some kind of essential Soviet identity. Such claims are something based on surveys. It's the page 727. Based on surveys like the one held in 1994, when people in Donetsk were asked to choose an identity that described them best, 40% of the respondents choose Soviet. This is brilliant. We will never know how they would have replied if this option was not in the list. So let's just not leave any option in the list, and it would be wonderful. They will all Ukrainians. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, how do you read that, Julia? Is there an alternative to this approach? Because he's arguing against identity and for situational studies of identity talk.
Yeah, he put this word in Greek. It's like it never existed. For me, it's like he says to me that I'm not existing because I'm a great representative of the Donetsk identity. First of all, I'm a person from Donetsk, so I'm just not existing.
Right. Great. Blind spots. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah.
Do you see something?
Yeah, I think Yulia mentioned a good point, but of course any article couldn't cover, for example, the whole complexity of phenomena which were occurred in Donbass of the first years of independence. It's very complicated. But on other hand, I want to tell maybe not to support Portnoy, but he has continued in this passage, and he said that Soviet identification, self-identification, was as a result of disappointment of social and economical problems which were connected with their ordinary life after 1991. So, of course, it's not a good explanatory, yes, but the way of thinking is quite understandable.
Okay. Other comments on strengths and weaknesses?
The article in general?
Yes. So let's pretend to have a quarrel with Andrei Portnoy.
Yeah, so going on to this idea that he said that there isn't a proper analytical language to describe the developments of Ukraine contemporarily. This is interesting because it made me think about, well, I mean, goes to any science or humanitarian science in general. What is the purpose of science? Is it to be predictive? Is it to describe what's going to happen in the future, or is it to understand social processes? And this is so this is kind of like what is a proper analytical language? Where does it orient the study? Is it something that will help? I don't know. Because throughout this study, when he's talking about this, like with the identity and how identity is oversimplified, this kind of reminds me of how a lot of these surveys that are very simplistic become instrumentalized for political means. So I'm getting the sense, is he commenting on necessarily only the academic discussion, or is he also talking about how a lot of these things are used politically? So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is that this analytical language also made me reflect on how the Russian Federation came to be studied. And so for example, in the US, maybe Stephen, you can comment on this, but a lot of some European researchers consider American-Russian studies still to be very influenced by Sovietology. And so what are the academic traditions that influence this lens, and then how can you actually come out of it? So what is the influence on the current lens of Ukrainian studies, and then how long will it take to get out of it, and how do you get out of it, and has this happened in other instances? So.
Sure. I could say a word about the Sovietological tradition, because I think it goes back at least to Poland in the 1930s, but in the American context, the model of totalitarianism was so important to the founding of institutes and to the study of the world we now call Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia. Books like Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, published 1951, books like Studies of Totalitarianism by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Carl Friedrich, political scientists, professors of government at Harvard, at the Kennedy School, published in the mid-1950s. In many ways, the US debate got stuck into two camps, between the so-called defenders of totalitarianism who believed in the promotion of NATO, in US militarism, in the containment of the Soviet Union, and the revisionists who really, I think, came out of a lot of New Left scholarship, works like William Appleman Williams, who wrote the sort of dean of the School of American New Left Diplomacy. He wrote a book in 1959 called The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. There are also a lot of scholars, I wouldn't exactly call them Sovietologists, but they were social historians, they were activists in the 1960s, many had supported the student movement, were against the Vietnam War, traveled to France. Many of them either became liberals or radicals. These were people like Stephen Cohen, who to my mind has absolutely no right to comment on Ukraine at all, because he doesn't travel to Kiev and doesn't speak Ukrainian. But nevertheless, he's a person who is interviewed countless times, and was interviewed countless times, largely through his connections in New York and at The Nation and in his work on CNN and so forth. But anyway, the revisionist school were people like Stephen Cohen, Alexander Rabinowitz, whose wife Janet Rabinowitz was one of the founders of Indiana University Press and all of its publications, still does really interesting work at Indiana, although she is retired. Others, I would say people like Ronald Suney, certainly, and Sheila Fitzpatrick, certainly part of the revisionist school. The American establishment got stuck in many ways between those two camps. One camp arguing for détente, US-Russian, US-Soviet cooperation. The other camp sort of revived by the neoconservatives, people like Richard Pipes. Recently, there's been a lot written about Richard Pipes. Jonathan Daly, who's in Chicago, is writing a new biography of Richard Pipes. Pipes was the consultant for the Reagan administration. He was a neoconservative in writing about the history of the Bolshevik Revolution. Anyway, the American establishment kind of got stuck in that. So the voices recently, I think interesting voices like Portnoy in Germany and Marlene Laurel, who was originally from Paris, have added more to this discussion. That's basically sort of my very short American summary of the Sovietological establishment. I remember as a graduate student, because my advisor was Abbott Gleason, Tom Gleason, one of the former presidents of ASSIS, or what once was AAASS. He wrote in 1995 this sort of summary of these debates in a book called Totalitarianism, 1995, The Inner History of the Cold War. Gleason, who was a student activist in the 60s and actually a student of Richard Pipes, was a good friend of people like Richard Workman and Richard Pipes, not Richard Pipes, but Richard Stites at Georgetown. Gleason wrote this book, I think, under the inspiration of people like Andrzej Walitsky. Walitsky was his friend, and many of the Central European dissidents. So Michnik, Havel, Conrad. That particular tradition of Central Europe in a kind of geopolitical way, but also, say, geocultural way, is a tradition, I would say, to which Timothy Snyder and Marcy Shore and others of a more literary bent belong. There's a kind of trajectory. They are products of Kundera, or products of this very famous essay, The Tragedy of Central Europe, which is not just Kundera. You can trace it back to János, who was a wonderful Hungarian medieval historian. But when Kundera published this book, like reinventing the idea of Central Europe, it was mainly a kind of republic of letters, like in the ideal Republica Literaria, but as an idea which would include Jewish history and literature, which would include Franz Kafka and Joseph Roth and that sort of thing, not in a national way, but in a kind of transnational way, where the real countries were not just nation states, but the real countries were like Campania and Pannonia, Danilo Kish Pannonia or Campania of Robert Musil. So I think that particular kind of cultural turn, I'm really giving you now sort of the long speech, because this is the topic for my new book. I'm writing a book called Otherlands, and I've just given you the first chapter. This cultural turn toward Kundera and toward Central Europe actually alienated a lot of people. It alienated Joseph Brodsky, who sort of joked about it and said, well, all of these writers, they're excluding Russians, they're excluding, Russian sort of writing traditions. They belong not to Central Europe, but they belong to West Asia. And they should actually know that they belong to West Asia. Like Europe doesn't exist. Let's belong to West Asia. Anyway, the Sovietological establishment really became sort of institutionalized in an American context. And increasingly after the end of the Cold War, the people who had been hired within the revisionist school were the people who were tenured and who were in charge of the many programs, like, Columbia, Stanford, which is more conservative, or neocon because of the Hoover Institution, but Michigan certainly became one of a certain number of schools for the revisionists, like Fitzpatrick, like SUNY, like Louis Segelbaum, and others. I hate attaching labels to everyone because it's not fair. I mean, I don't really know if I'm neoconservative or neo-totalitarian. I'm certainly not a democracy promoter because I kind of fail to believe in it. But I see this particular tradition in the American or Anglo-American universe increasing in its sort of institutionalization. And this is one thing that Portnoy, as a public intellectual, is trying to argue against. I don't really know if he succeeds. Other questions?
May I
Go ahead.
make a little response? It's very interesting theme about kind of conversation Sovietologists into specialists which are dealing with Ukraine, and Portnov actually argued with this point that Ukraine is considered like byproduct of imperial politics, and he said that such kind of vision of perspective of Ukraine make, for example, make study of Ukrainian language absolutely senseless. And he said that it is not okay. We have to, and he especially he said about German context. He said we have to establish special Ukrainian scientific centers, and it's hilarious, but he actually works in one of it. And after Maidan, as I know, emerged at least several, for example, in Munich, in Bamberg, yeah, and maybe probably in some other scientific centers. But maybe the main issue just for me is not about necessity. Do we have to establish new Ukrainian studies or we don't? I think that it's about this lack of heuristic model, heuristic approach, or explanatory model, because as for me, in my humble opinion, it's kind of reduction, because Portnov says about oversimplifying by, for example, Western scholars, yes, of Ukrainian history, but he oversimplifies new Ukrainian studies and the ways of its development as well. As for me, it's not a good way if you say, for example, okay, we have lack of language, yes, lack of vocabulary and lack of explanatory models. Maybe it's just lack of understanding the processes which were occurred, and it is, as I think, it is very very uncomplicated way to say that we have deal with, for example, social anthropological approach with economic, with politology, so we should be interdisciplinary. And on the other hand, we should gather scholars from Belarus, from Russia. Where is the methodology?
It's a good question. Maybe we can postpone that. Let me thank you, because I want to now move to Marlene Laruelle. We'll come back to the discussion about methodology tomorrow. This should be one of your big questions, hopefully, for the Borderlands. We need a methodology. It can't be everything. Okay? Thank you very much.
Okay, so hi, and you had already the introduction of Marlene Laruelle by Steven. Thank you for that. And I just want to point out that she wrote it together with Ellen Rivera, which is independent political researcher, and she cooperates also with the University of Washington. Yeah. So the first question is, what is actually the Intermarry and where it is? And for this question, the authors already answered. This question, authors answers already in like first paragraph, and so they suppose that it's like the proverbial cat. Some concepts have several lives, or like the mythological phoenix, they can be reborn from the ashes. This is certainly the case of Intermarry, a geopolitical concept that envisages an alliance of countries reaching from the Baltic Sea over the Black Sea to Aegean Sea that would serve as a third power bloc between Germany and Russia. So now we will together trace Intermarry concept through the whole century. So I would rather start because it's kind of a long period. So idea of creation of power bloc between Western Europe, especially Germany and Russia, was first raised at the end of the World War I, and in 1919 it was used for the first time by Sir Halford John Mackinder, who discussed it as an opposition between the heartland and continental powers and sea powers, which was at that time the UK. But the best known promoter of this term intermarium was the Polish leader Józef Pilsudski, who promoted intermarium in attempt to firstly establish an independent Second Polish Republic and then to create a federation of states that would be strong enough to compete to Germany as well as raising Soviet Union. This proposed federation was called Eastern European League of Nations and included Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Finland, Baltics, and Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Nevertheless, of course, none of these new states wanted actually to be under the Polish leadership. And the second Pilsudski project was called Promethean League, and it was promoted by a group of nations, as a group of nations fighting against the Soviet Union. And maybe you ask why Promethean? Because Pilsudski would empower minorities as Prometheus empowered mankind emerge of shadows of the gods. And this league was created after Simon Petlura gave up the fight against the Soviet Union. And it was based in Warsaw and enjoyed mostly support from Poles, because the Polish army actually get a straight support from this organization. The third concept was introduced by Józef Beck, which was Foreign Minister of Poland, and this concept promoted Third Europe as because Poland signed the two non-aggression pacts with the USSR and Germany, and the Third Europe should serve as a guarantee for the Polish security. However, it was supported just by Hungary, Latvia, and Estonia, and of course it was then not successful again. The second rebirth of intermarry concept we can trace in the Second World War period, when the British Secret Intelligence Service called Central European, so this intermarium organization was now called Central European Federal Club. It was based in Rome, and this club gradually became a worldwide network led by Czech military officer Lev Prchala, and later it was changed to Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, ABN, which included also the British, America, and now also German secret services. The third intermarium appeared in immediate afterwar period, and it was again as a memory to Pilsudski concept raised again, but now it was blended in very far right way, and ABN was based now in Munich and served as a coordinating center for all anti-communist organizations. And as the fascists were first to mobilize against the Soviet Union in 1930s, ABN recruited many of them and became the largest and most important umbrella for former Nazi collaborators in the world. And after during 50s and 60s, it integrated to new established World Anti-Communist League and became much more moderate. Next one. Intermarium 4. In the late 2000s, with the growing power of Russia and its growing interferences to near, abroad, and Central Asia regions, the concepts of Mackinder Heartland and now also Brzezinski Grand Chessboard became again to the higher notion. And especially after 2008 and 2014 and the Russian activities concerning this time, the US attempt to mobilize Poland and Romania as their biggest military allies in the region, and they kind of pushed them to distance themselves from the EU and become leaders of this new Intermarry. It would then serve as an opposition bloc to Russian threats, and especially it would become a base for an expansion of NATO and involvement, particularly military, of the EU-US to the region. So, simultaneously with the think tanks in the US, the concept of Intermarry emerged also in Poland. But actually this time it was more of economic than political or military character. And Poland became a driving force of Central and East European integration. And Intermarry this time served as a platform to enhance these countries' development of economic markets, and it was focused especially to energetical, transportation and communication infrastructure. And it was also supported by Belarus, but in this case it was more politically based because they used this concept like argument against Lukashenko's incorporation to Russia. And the last Intermarry 6 is the most contemporary idea, and it is mostly present in the rhetoric of far-right Ukrainian political spectrum. This trend accelerated especially after Euromaidan, and it is mostly connected with the rehabilitation of the OUN and the reintroduction of Bandera as a national hero. It is supported mainly by neo-Nazist patriots, and on military basis is supposed to integrate nationalist movements and right-based political parties from the whole Baltic Black Sea region. So there is emerging an idea of European Reconquista and Pan-Europa, which is actually, as the authors proposed, very similar to Dugin's idea of Federation of Lisbon to Vladivostok, but of course without Russia. And I actually had I've seen a very strong video, but unfortunately it doesn't work here, so you can see at least some snapshots from the video, so you can see that it's really strong. And to sum up, I would say that Intermarry can be understood as a long-term geopolitical concept which underlines the role of small nations between the two big nations, Russia and Germany. This concept through the last century re-emerged a few times, always when it was needed to mobilize these countries and kind of in context to resist their big neighbors' dominations. And it also serves as a platform to distance itself from the EU and promote itself as the real Europe or non-Europe with a different identity and different values. But nevertheless, there are of course many contradictions, especially because all of these countries are already members of the EU or attempt to be ones. And also the relation of some of these countries to Russia is a question, like this pro-Russian approach of many countries is kind of question. So I will finish it with maybe a question if you would say that Intermarry is actually a real concept, or it is especially nowadays rather just a term, or maybe rather kind of slogan which serves for some legitimization of mostly radical approach.
Could you, Alex, answer your own question? What do you think? Because there's so many different floating states here, or floating discourses, or floating concepts. Although Intermarry is associated with Piłsudski and Prometheanism and interwar Poland, there was the Intermarry idea, which Marlene talks about, promoted by Britain, France, and the Vatican.
Yeah.
Then there is an Intermarry idea which is promoted by a Nazi collaborator whose files have been now declassified, Ferenc Vajta, whom you mentioned. There's also a crisis, I think, of Visegrad Europe, which we're still living through, because Visegrad at least was held in the 1990s to be, in some ways, the prototype for a new cooperative, not necessarily pro-American, but at least Atlanticist sphere of influence. And it's, I think, the question about these imagined geographies, are they just sort of like the fantasies in the imagination of crazy politicians, or do they actually have some sort of purchasing power? Do they mean anything? Are you able to answer your own question?
I would suppose that it's more a term, like more like this fascination, or how you call it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all, in my view, it always serves more to like promote some activities than actually as it would even really functionate as some integrated organ.
Okay. Let's throw out the question. I mean, I remember actually, I was in Krakow when I heard Rumsfeld's speech, Donald Rumsfeld's speech in Prague in, I think it was January 2003, when Donald Rumsfeld gave that really notorious speech about the New Europe. Remember the story about the New Europe? It provoked a really violent reaction, the New Europe versus the old Europe, by the French and Germans in particular, who together with Turkey and Russia were not supportive of the US invasion in Iraq. That's another story. But in any case, Rumsfeld drew this, idea at this moment of a kind of new American pro-militaristic support, not just for Afghanistan, but also for Iraq, the movement of military bases out of Europe, with the promotion in Poland and Romania of these as sort of being like, what colonial India was for the British. I remember these discourses at that time, because I was in Poland, and just being sort of like shocked by how fast they began to be circulated in the media, international media at that time. Those of you who are in the audience, do you see this Międzymoria or Intermarium in your own countries? Is it mentioned? Is it ignored? Is it associated with Nazis and far-right collaborators and intelligence services? Have you heard of it at all?
Yeah, it was discussed about the Cold War. I don't remember who was from whom it started, but I suppose from Poland, that it was associated exclusively with Pilsudski and this Międzymoria idea. But it wasn't like a broad discussion, so some media just discussed it a bit, and then it ceased.
Okay.
I would maybe say, the example of Czech Republic, that the concept is totally like unknown. Unknown. And I think it's connected really because even Czech Republic kind of distanced itself from Visegrad 4, and it's kind of promote itself as to be more Western than the other countries. So.
Okay.
Maybe in
Yeah,
Ukraine,
please.
as I see, we have two different camps of promoters of Intermarium idea, and one of them is Nationalny Korpus. It's totally right guys from with some extreme ideas.
Right or far right?
Maybe even far right.
Okay.
And on the other hand, we have a camp of right conservative philosophers who just adore this idea, and they said that it's maybe one appropriate way of our future. So we have to unite with other countries, and we can, for example, live in 21st century.
Who are they exactly? Who are their names? Who are writing? They're not like Ukrainian
No, they Ukrainian.
They are Ukrainian?
Yeah. I don't remember, but I can Google it and
Okay.
say.
Okay.
And what time? It's now or
No, yeah.
As far as I remember,
Kuczynski?
Mhm.
Please.
as far as I remember, Andreas Ullmann was actually supporting this conception.
Ullmann
by
was part of it.
earlier.
Yeah.
Well, in theory, it's totally like Pilsudski's idea, I think. But actually, I don't know why, but in my mind, I somehow also, maybe because it's called Intermarry, somehow I connected it to the Free Seas initiative. So even
Okay.
for a moment, I was like, because it also kind of like, it's a similar region, but it's like on the region that it focuses, right? But I mean, I understand that it focuses on completely different goals. It's more about like economic development, but still, it's interesting that actually it's. And that one even focuses on the Free Seas, right? So,
Okay.
while this one on two. So,
Okay. Alex, having read Marlene Laruelle, maybe you could talk about her attitude toward NATO. What do you think? Because she's using these original sources, declassified documents. She talks about pro-NATO think tanks in a certain way. So how do you think she relates to the future of NATO as an observer of geopolitics?
I have always like impression that she kind of criticized NATO as being like expensive and I don't know. What do you think?
I'm asking you.
Yeah, I'm interested to your.
You're right. We haven't talked about NATO much yet at all. Maybe I can throw that out to you now because I think it's extraordinarily important. We have a very different view here of Laruelle than Shore, right? Because Marcy Shore is looking at the participation of individuals and individual agency in revolution, whereas Laruelle is a very, very good and very talented policy wonk, right? Like Umland is a policy wonk. So it's the view, sort of like from on high, the bird's eye view of the map. Whereas Shore, even though she's in Vienna, was trying to really sort of like get into the intimate three-dimensional worlds of humans making a choice during a revolution. Ukraine is mentioned in Laruelle's article, but really only in association with the far right. And that should tell you something, right? So the attitude toward NATO is what, from this perspective? Those of you who've read the article. Does she think it's a good idea? NATO enlargement, NATO expansion? Alex? What do you think? I'll read it. So on page, here we go, on page 15, we'll talk about transatlantic partnerships. So she writes about geopolitics and Intermarry. This is on page 15. In 2015, Stratfor recognized in its Geopolitical Diary web project that, quote, it has been discussing an alliance system called the Intermarry for quite a while. Note the moment, this is after Maidan, and referred to Pilsudski's original project. Quote, we have been arguing that given the re-emergence of Russian power, the idea of the Intermarry, supported not by France, but by the United States and focused on Russia, would become inevitable. Former United States Army Europe Commander General Ben Hodges' statements on prepositioning essentially announced Intermarry, or its small beginning. This is 2015. The area in which the equipment would be prepositioned stretches from the Baltic states through Poland and then skips to Romania and Bulgaria on the Black Sea. Note, our conference is also about the Black Sea. Remember how Catherine the Great tried to turn it into a military lake. It signals to the Russians that whatever happens in Ukraine, the next line of countries is the line that triggers the alliance. Unquote. In 2017, Friedman returned to the idea stating, quote, the Intermarry is a concept, really an eventuality, that I have spoken about for nearly a decade.
Boosted by the current US-Russia tensions, he has advanced a more precise vision of what this union is meant to be. And this is the key, exactly as Alex noted, picked up on insightfully. He sees Poland and Romania, the two closest military allies of the US in the region, as the, quote, true foundations of the Intermarry, unquote, and does not hesitate to hope that the Intermarry would challenge the, quote, hegemony of the 1950s style corporations that dominate European economics, unquote, and promote an economic model that would be more entrepreneurial, more closely resembling the United States, unquote here. Last paragraph. The concept has been supported by other pro-NATO think tanks. We can ask how influential they are, such as the Institute of World Politics, a national security and international affairs graduate school founded in 1990. There are some people, I would say, who are sort of on the margins, and maybe Tomasz Zaritsky could comment on this. There are advocates of the Intermarry, like Marek-Jan Horakiewicz, who has the Kościuszko Chair of Polish Studies. There's a Center for Intermarry Studies, but I'm not really sure if this is extended beyond Poland. I don't see that yet. There are many kind of like blueprints geopolitically for new projects. I'm actually a little bit skeptical about Laruelle kind of exaggerating this. She does want to tie in a history of the intelligence services in the 1950s in collaboration with the American government and the CIA. I think that's perfectly fine. There needs to be more research on Nazi collaboration and the far right in Europe, but I'm not quite sure that the leap actually makes sense. I don't have access to the Pentagon's secret files, right? I don't actually know what's going on in Pentagon City, but of course, in 2015, there were conferences held at the Pentagon about the future of NATO and its security challenges. Go ahead.
I guess the other point is, if this is the largely like Pilsudskian or Polish conception, imaginary, call it what you will, like Romania's involvement in this as the other side of, let's call it the Intermarry curtain, right? Like the other side of this line.
Yes.
Right. Doesn't have much play. It's constantly talked about as, oh, we need Romania's involvement in this. Romania will be involved in this. And you have a little bit of like a Romanian Minister of Foreign Affairs attending a meeting, or maybe some references to the Iron Guard and how this was mobilized, in the immediate post-war. But how does this play outside of Poland? Like, is there a notion of motul Maria, or whatever you might call it in Romania, that captures the same imaginary, or is this just kind of wonkishness and attempting to carve out some geopolitical order that not everybody has bandwidth on?
Yeah, I think it's an open question. For Horakiewicz, it's an interesting question because he was appointed by former President Bush, to serve as the president of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, we have a kind of right-wing leadership, very right-wing leadership, in sort of U.S. Holocaust Memorial Studies, including the museum. You'll notice, if you've been following politics this week, I signed it. There was a petition among, sort of like all of the leading Holocaust historians of the United States, because there was a controversy about concentration camps. Right? The idea that there are concentration camps in the United States, I think unquestionably there are concentration camps in the United States, detention camps. If we study the history of Romania and prison camps and the detention or detainees of people who were on the front fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, there's absolutely no question to my mind that these black camps existed and need to be understood, like we need to write the history of Guantanamo Bay. So, the idea of pushing Poland and Romania to be sort of like the outposts of the American military empire is something, obviously, that Laruelle really doesn't want to support. I also wonder what this means for the future of NATO if there is a Trump re-election in 2020. So, anyway, I want to thank Alex for her presentation and for opening our thoughts to a larger geopolitical world. Thanks. Okay, so in the last maybe 15, 20 minutes,
I'm just going to do a very quick presentation of some of the thoughts behind the books that I've been working on. So you came probably to my MapMan talk. I'll pass it around. This is also something that I've been working on. I'm giving a lecture in Chicago at the Newberry Library. There is a conference that takes place every couple of years in the history of cartography, the project of the history of cartography, which really started in the 70s and 80s. This is a series of the Nebenzahl lectures on post-colonial studies and decolonizing the map. I'll also just pass this around. There's a lot of really interesting work done about geography, geopolitics, national self-determination, and the world after empire. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in my presentation today on the books that I published, the 3 books that I published, and the ones sort of that I'm working on or working through some of these ideas right now. So what I've been working on, I think it's sort of lovely that I get to talk about my own work since I've been talking about others now for 9 days. What I've really been working on in the world of public history and social media are 3 different disciplines or sub-disciplines. And I would call these political geography, geopolitics, and critical cartography studies. So there is an absolute flood of maps, at least, you know, in the context of 1918, 1919. This map that you see right here was published by J. Horobin. He was actually a kind of left-wing socialist in England, rare breed for quite some time, who produced atlases, very influential atlases. J.F. Horobin was his name, in the 1930s in particular, taking a different angle toward the Treaty of Versailles without falling into, let's say, the national or ethno-national traps. I use my Twitter feed in order to make these maps available for a general public, so it's kind of like my dumping ground for all of the different maps which I managed to somehow secure from Russian military archives and declassified documents and those sorts of things over the past 20 years. I think maps are absolutely everywhere, but they're not necessarily well analyzed in an interdisciplinary way. I was just thinking about this because Tomek sent me this wonderful work about linguistic pragmatics and semiotics. There's a heritage in critical geography and critical geography studies which I think goes back to the postmodern turn, or the sort of moment emerging out of post-structuralism to postmodernism, in which master narratives collapse. So you'll note here there's a sort of trajectory from the mid-1970s up until the present for a lot of these major works. I've been involved with the University of Chicago Press for at least 10 years. The University of Chicago Press produced this wonderful series in the history of cartography to get out of Eurocentric frameworks. And you can think about this as to study the map which is not the Mercator projection, right? So the Mercator projection, which was absolutely dominant since the mid to late 16th century, centering the Atlantic. There are, hundreds of other projections, but I would say at least, 20 or 30 projections, alternative projections, which you can use in order to map the world. The history of cartography emerged from the work of Brian Harley, who was in the UK, died in 1991, and David Woodward, who was a scholar of Renaissance print culture. If you've read Benedict Anderson, you know about the importance of print culture for the development of nations, nationalisms, and imagined communities. Woodward, Gesundheit, was a scholar of the Renaissance. And so these two guys together tried to turn out of Eurocentrism to the pre-modern pictorial traditions. They looked very carefully at indigenous traditions of mapping. They looked very carefully at the Wissenstransfer, or the transfer of knowledge. For example, Arabic maps, the work of Al-Idrisi. This was a very interesting sort of initiative which is still ongoing. Volumes 4 and 5 will be produced in the next couple of years. I'll send you the link on our shared page on Facebook. Volumes 1, 2, 3, and 6 are available for free. You can read this if you're interested. Volume 6 is edited by Mark Monmonier, retired professor at Syracuse, who wrote How to Lie with Maps. I mentioned Benedict Anderson. One of the inspirations for the chapter, I think a very important chapter if you study the history of statistics and censuses, the rise of censuses, and the rise of how to see like a state in the middle of the 19th century. Tongchai Winnichako was actually a student activist and a communist dissident. He's now retired as a professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He published his book on the history of Thailand, which is an absolutely beautiful book. In the 20th century, it's a book called Siam Mapped, published by University of Hawaii Press, 1988. Anderson used his work quite extensively in trying to put together that chapter. Monmonier's How to Lie with Maps, now I think in its 3rd or maybe 4th edition, published by Chicago. How many of you have ever read Larry Wolff? A few of you? Okay, yes. I would imagine that Professor Zaritsky did. Inventing Eastern Europe. So there are inspirations for Larry Wolff. It's a combination in many ways of Mary Louise Pratt's Contact Zones, and then very awkwardly joining Foucault and Said, right? Culture and Imperialism. But it's an absolutely fascinating book, which I read and reread. Wolff is actually coming out with a new book on Woodrow Wilson and self-determination, which will be published. I will interview him on my podcast in January of 2020 by Stanford University Press. Maria Todorova, historian of Eastern Europe, originally from Bulgaria, her work Imagining the Balkans. I think this is an exceptionally interesting work because it also challenged the modernization thesis and the idea of backwardness in Eastern Europe, a lot of development theory which still, I think, lingers on today. Gerard Toll, one of the more interesting policy thinkers, he just published a book called Near Abroad, which is about Georgia and Ukraine, actually sort of like comparing the world of the rose-orange revolutions and the involvement of American policy thinkers through the 2000s and the 2010s. It's a book which is really important if you want to study Putin and Russian foreign policy.
Excuse me, what is the title?
It's called Near Abroad. I'll also send the link to that. Toll wrote one of the most influential books for critical geopolitics, a new field that emerged, challenging the old idea of classical geopolitics. So if you think of Mackinder, if you think of Haushofer or Chelane, Critical Geopolitics was a book published in 1996 using semiotics, using post-structural analysis, using discourse analysis in order to understand the world of maps, not just how they're produced and consumed, but also how they're communicated and why. Pickles, I think, very interestingly, also originally from the UK. Toll was from Northern Ireland. There's a lot of really interesting things to say about the Irish border. Pickles wrote this book called A History of Spaces. I'll return to his idea of geocoding in a minute. Gunnar Olsson, who is from Uppsala, was one of my inspirations when I was studying in Sweden, wrote a critique of cartographic reason, which I think is in many ways, like following in the Immanuel Kant tradition, a critique of the aesthetics of cartography and space. So it's a critique of cartographic reason. From Olsson, there is this idea that there are only 3 things that are necessary to make a map. 3 things. The 3 things that are necessary to make a map are 1, a fixed point. if you have a center, every map has a prejudice, every map has a center. If European, you're European, you say, okay, there's Europe, there's a center, we don't know where Dimitta is, but it has a center. Every map has to have a fixed point, because from the fixed point, you can then draw a translatable key or a scale and have a projection or screen. These are the three basic components of a map. He writes about this in a book called Abysmal, which I think is a wonderful kind of history of Western civilization and maps in it. And there are some other works. Sumati Ramaswamy, very, very wonderful thinker, Duke Humanities professor, historian of India. She also wrote books about the fantasies on the Indian subcontinent. The Lost Land of Lemuria is another one of her books. Speaking about the partitions between, really the partitions of 1947 and the world of Indian, Pakistani, and Kashmiri scholarship. I'd also recommend, not just to promote my own work. I worked in 10 languages and 24 different archives and libraries to research this book. It was my dissertation. It took me 10 years and a whole lot of bribing Russian archivists and libraries to get military maps, military topographical maps. The book, which is published by University of Chicago Press, covers really three different types of cartography, I'd say. Military, historical, pedagogical, pedagogical, and also ethnographic. Those three traditions of maps. There are plenty of maps in the book. I think something like 80, 85 maps. I used German sources, Polish sources. I had to work at the Ossolineum in Poland, in the Biblioteka Narodowa, which was wonderful in Warsaw, who helped me understand the destruction of Polish maps by the Nazis in 1944. Anyway, this book I published in 2012, and then Edney's book, you can follow it, just published. There's a podcast in which I feature him, which came out last week. Okay. So why maps? I talked about this at Kharkiv today. I want to get out of the traditions of realism and historicism and enter the world of modernism and postmodernism in a different kind of way. So seen here at the top is the famous Surrealist map from 1929. Again, playing with the idea of scale and proportion, how it is in our own minds through cognition and perception we perceive of the countries to which we think we belong. This one, does anyone know the origins of this? You may have read these.
A few different versions, like the one or Europe according to the British, or Europe according to...
Yeah. It's produced by a Bulgarian anarchist who I think is an extraordinarily talented graphic designer. His name is Janko Cvetkov. He began this project of producing the Atlas of Prejudice in 2007. And there's several versions of this. The versions of the Atlas of Prejudice now, it's sort of like the world according to Putin, foods you shouldn't eat, those sorts of things. But these are stereotypes, right? So, according to this, tourist colony, fashion victims, Don Quixote, group sex, whatever. This is a surrealist tradition or absurdist tradition, which I think needs to be placed right alongside the whole scientific wissenschaftliche, nauczne tradition. In Crit Carto, just to really kind of summarize, I'll post this on Google Drive so you don't have to worry about copying things. I think there are maybe 6, 7, 8 different schools of thought in discourse analysis and semiotics, sort of like coming out of the world of Umberto Eco. One can certainly add more schools. But the old-fashioned schools, which Harley and Woodward were really trying to get at and criticize, were the first 3 or 4. The intentionalist school, the idea that there's one person, one great man behind every single map. What a map means according to its author. It's sometimes called the intentionalist fallacy, right? The functionalist school, more sociological from below, sociopolitical or sociocultural, what the map does in society, how it moves or orders or mobilizes populations. I'm always interested in studying statistics and the rise of statistical demography since the 1830s and 1840s, how categories of groups are created. Portnoy mentions this a little bit, although I don't think very well, in talking about reductions. So, for example, the concept of nationality or nationalität, narodowości, these come out really of the 1840s and 1850s in the context of the 1848-49 revolutions. The Russian Geographical Society is really interesting because from its foundation in St. Petersburg in 1845, it begins what I call frontier monitoring. And its frontier monitoring extends to the establishment of branches, some of which open and then close in places like Vilna or Kiev or Tbilisi, Tiflis, or Semipalatinsk, there's another one there, or Irkutsk. These become sort of regional offices in the 19th century up until the end of the Russian Empire to monitor demographics, to monitor frontiers, and that involves the production of maps. Institutionalist, what institutions? Well, it's usually the state, but it's also commercial firms. To give one example of this, actually, Eugeniusz Romer was very much in the tradition of commercial cartography from the German and Austrian lands, or Austro-Hungarian lands. This was incredibly important because he had a number of quarrels with his cartographic firm, Książnica Atlas, as it was called, Princess Atlas, with the state. I found these wonderful documents from the 1920s in which Romer refused really to sell out the operation of Polish cartography to the Second Republic. And there's a very different Polish tradition, I would say, between state and society and cartography than there is in the German and Russian traditions. Structuralist mentalities, or stereotypes, how stereotypes are produced in maps, and then other examples, social constructivist, post-structuralist, and so on. I think there are a number of ideas, sort of smaller ideas that one can take from this trajectory of scholarship. One interesting idea that I find, you can barely read it, is the notion of the geocoded world. I think this is fascinating because Alexei asked the question about images rather than texts. I'm certainly image-centric. I write my books like an art historian, or I pretend to be an art historian. Pickles begins to kind of devise a new theory of colors. Now, for those of you who are, sort of like art dilettantes like me, you know how important colors are, and especially in cartography, because, half of cartography is propaganda. You absolutely want to advertise your titular nation, your dominant language in red or pink. It can't be a white-black spot, right? So, the colors, I think, from Goethe forward, understanding from Goethe to Kandinsky forward, become extraordinarily important for the graphic design of these images. What do they represent? Just to give one more example from the colors, I think the great trick of producing maps is to naturalize borders and frontiers. So, like, why isn't soil purple? Or why is the grass green? Right? And if you change the colors, obviously you change the perspective away from the dominant school of realism and historicism, objective representation of terrain, of topographical relief from the 19th century forward. Okay, lines. I also want to pay attention to lines. Marcy Shore in her book writes about crossing the line in an ethical sense. There is also the idea of transgression, crossing the border. Voila, I've crossed the border, now I'm empowered. Right? Or now I stand over the map and now I'm empowered. I use this in order to write about the prejudices and emotions in maps. Mapmen, just very quickly, the things that I collected in a kind of eclectic way. I was very interested in files that were destroyed by geographers and cartographers. So, for example, letters Teleki, before he committed suicide, burned his correspondence. Bowman and his son, before they donated their files to Johns Hopkins University, also destroyed evidence. This is a technique that I use from a lot of microhistorians. Natalie Zeman-Davis is one of the great, she's now 91 years old, historians, microhistorians, to develop this technique of trying to understand fictions in the archive. That you don't just go to an archive, look at documents, and find truth. You go to the documents with your own fantasies, and you see what you want to see. And many of those sort of operations for historians seeing what you want to see involve selecting the maps and telling the stories that you want to tell. Other examples, writings by others, secondary literature, and so on. I'll just show a few of the other maps that I really wanted to spend some more time on in my talk. The idea of bulwarks. So I just came out with an article in a volume that is co-edited by Lilia Berezhnaya and Heidi Heinkircher at the Herder Institute, where I'm involved in a lot of their digital projects. The book is called Bulwark Nations. It was just published a few months ago by Berghahn Books 2019. There are many of these, I would say, sort of like the Antimorali Christianitatis in both Hungary and in Poland as a way to draw the line of Christendom, and of course a way to draw the line of Europe as Christendom, which I would say is something certainly that historians like Norman Davies did in writing Europe a History, this grand giant book that he produced at the turn of the century. This is one of the maps. It's made in 1883 in Krakow to commemorate the defeat in Vienna. I love when battle defeats are commemorated, you know, cross-reference Battle of Kosovo 1389 or Battle of White Mountain. Reviewing maps critically, there are many arguments, I think, which are important to territorialization and deterritorialization. Charles Meyer, who is a U.S. historian of East Germany and a historian of empires, was also a contributor to the Historikerstreit. He argues in his book and in a couple of different articles that maps were essential to the age of empires and nationalism because there is a moment in time from about the 1840s to the 1970s of high territorialization by states. This might be something that's actually ending. If you think about how the US state or the US government sees the world, the US state and the US government sees the world as a collection of military bases, which are borderless. We don't actually even know how many military bases there are. The Pentagon knows. It thinks maybe 700, 800, we don't know. Or, you know, the idea of deterritorialization as a space for real estate conquest, right? That there are actually no limits to the ownership of property, and that property can be obtained in a kind of neoliberal regime. One can even own a border and implement one's own sort of border zone there. Another, I think, really important idea that comes out of this scholarship on cartography is that maps conceal as much as they reveal about the past. This is something from Susan Schulten, who is in Denver, Colorado, U.S. historian, has written a lot about 19th century cartography. Just to go through the maps, you know, you've seen these are examples from Poland, the combination of both science and propaganda. The notion of a greater Poland. Here at the left, the historical map of Poland. This was one of the maps used by Eugeniusz Romer during World War I, both, let's say, in the public sphere and for the purpose of sending his geographical and statistical atlas to the West. Maps as a dangerous enterprise. So my Ukrainian example is Rudnitsky, but of course, my Ukrainians can be compared with other people. If you take away nothing from my presence in Ukraine, realize that it's not just Ukrainians in Ukrainian history. This is sort of the Belarusian version of Rudnitsky. His politics were more to the left. He was a social democrat, Arkad Smolich, and a soil scientist who was arrested in 1931, sent eastward into Eurasia, where he became an agricultural and forestry expert, no longer could produce the borders of an independent Belarus. Obviously, he does this at the Wilsonian moment in 1918-19. It's no longer possible. You cannot produce these maps in Soviet Belarus. He is a victim of the NKVD, shot with other Belarusian intellectuals at the age of 47 in 1938. I've got an article coming out about him in Berlin and in a co-edited volume with the Polish Academy of Sciences. Other examples, so there are still these floating discourses of a greater Ukraine, and Rudnitsky, who was the founder of Ukrainian geography cartography, made a number of these maps. He made the first Ukrainian language maps in the 1900s. There are some wall maps, very interesting maps. He made many of the most influential ethnographic maps, including this one, the Ethnographic Survey Map of Ukraine. This was produced, published in both German and English during the war. So, sort of takeaway points about this. In my research, I shift the history of cartography more toward a kind of post-truth environment, but I'm very wary of cliches by French intellectuals, because I think French intellectuals, as much as East European nationalists, are not just full of wisdom. One of these is Jean Baudrillard, the idea that the map precedes the territory. Well, of course the map precedes the territory. Anybody who's ever done urban planning knows this.
It's how you see like a sneak.
It's how you draw, as you saw in our excursion with Zhenya, it's how you draw lines. It's how you draw streets. It's how you create room for housing. This is a total academic cliche. But what Jean Baudrillard does, I'll post this on Google Drive, is he creates stages of simulation, which I think, borrow from the left, like Guy Debord, Society of the Spectacle, in order to understand the production of images in a sort of post-truth world. We're moving from what he calls the sacramental stage, where we believe the map, the image, is a reflection of profound reality, to the last stage, which is the world of Arte and Russian media and a whole lot of other media. Pure simulation, hyper-real, where the simulacrum has no relationship to the reality at all. Sign play. Signs reflect other signs. Derrida would be really happy. Lives and identities are a mere artifice. Pretenses to reality are naive and sentimental, which of course makes revolutionary choices really, really difficult. When you make a revolutionary choice, you stand by your truth, not by your simulacra, or maybe a little bit of both. So this is a cliche. Other things, maps and post-war losers. I hate the word losers. It has a very bad American context. It's why Americans like to watch Donald Trump on TV, because he was supposedly a winner. That's how his persona got created in the American media. But these are maps made by individuals on the wrong side of World War I. And so the circulation or resuscitation of the images in the 20s and 30s become really important for the revision of borders. I argue in MapMen in my book that states actually with flexible frontiers want to maintain that flexibility of frontiers. It gives them the maximum ability of revision and mobility and movement. So it's not that states need and have to draw borders. Especially if you go back to the early modern context, it's that states want to maintain flexible frontiers. And I would argue that's certainly the case in Russia's neo-imperialism today, and American as well. Other examples of collaboration, I write a lot about Hungary and the Hungarian geobody in the book. I think the institutionalization of schools, national schools of revisionist cartography is also an institutionalization of anti-Semitism, at least in the history of Hungarian and maybe Romanian cartography as well. So, to review just these schools of thought, because I want to be able to feed you lunch, and some further recommendations that I would make to you. If you're coming at geography and cartography, look at it historically, obviously, but think very carefully about its uses in a new digital, non-paper environment. Some of the really interesting works that I've read, I would say in the past several years, Jeremy Crampton, another UK geographer. This is one of the first introductions to the School of Critical GIS and GIS Studies. Now it's a thing. It's really important. You can go to the university and enroll in GIS studies. They will train you to become a technician, and then you'll run completely afoul of this, and you'll look for critical geography because you actually have some sense of morality and ethics. Neil, this is his, Jim is collapsing.
That's why I'm here.
I've just described your life. Thomas Nail, another really interesting philosopher, he wrote The Theory of the Border. I would highly recommend this in philosophy. It's about walling and fencing. Walls, fences, I think. The idea of the border as a wall, obviously one can see this if you study not just, say, the US, but also Hungary today, many other places where movement is rendered impossible. This is the winner of last year's 2018 Political Science Prize, the APSA, American Political Science Association Prize. Longo wrote, I think, a brilliant book. He's a student of Sela Ben Habib at Yale, now a professor. He's on Twitter. I follow him, he follows me. This is a book about the securitization of the US-Mexican border. And he has a very interesting concept which he calls co-bordering. So, not idealized, but co-bordering as a kind of state terrorism. So the idea of reintroducing checkpoints, of monitoring and passportizing individuals is not this sort of neoliberal paradise of being able to pass through borders like 20 times a day, but the securitization regime, the management regime, is a form of state terror, a form of state power. Longo, I think, has a very interesting tension between his liberal cosmopolitanism and his anarchism, but this is a way of thinking about borders for the 21st century. And now it's over, and you should eat lunch. Thank you. Questions? Go ahead.
I don't know if any of you all noticed this. Do you remember when we went to the Literature Museum? And
Yes.
they had those, like Volya was a recent comic book, a graphic novel set in a revisionist Ukraine, I think Ukrainian First Republic, People's Republic, I forget the nomenclature. But they made use of this map, if you want to go back 4 or 5
Which one
slides.
is it?
The map of an expanded Ukraine, 2 slides back, maybe? 3?
Back to the
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And I took some pictures of it because I was interested, not so much because it's like the steampunk universe or what have you, but because it draws on this imaginary and puts this statistical gloss over how a certain vision of Ukraine would have functioned in the geopolitics of this revised interwar period. I took some photographs of it, but it's fairly interesting, and if anybody can translate the Ukrainian for me or other interlocutors, it would be cool.
I mean, Russian media loves this because Russian media, like Globus Ukraine, it loves the idea that there's somehow, like Ukrainian geopoliticians wanting to conquer the world. It suits the discourse in Russia really well to have the production of images like this. So, I mean, certainly if you look at a lot of the museums around Russia and Ukraine, not to mention Hungary after the Treaty of Trianon, it's politically offensive to have these maps of territory which are not the actual existing present state borders. Think about it today with maps of Crimea. If you go to a place or read a newspaper and it includes a map, you know the politics of the place and the product just by looking at Crimea. On my Twitter feed, people are obsessed with giving me comments about Crimea. Like anything I post, if I post a map showing Crimea part of Russia, obviously it means I'm a Russian nationalist. If I post maps showing Crimea part of Ukraine, obviously it means I'm a defender of, the CIA in Ukraine. So, like, there's this assumption, I think it's a really important social assumption, that there has to be some kind of consensus on the map. There is no consensus on the map. Maps do not stabilize identity or borders. Maps keep identity flexible. And actually maps keep states flexible because states can revise those borders, either through war or something else. So this is a really important map, and it's also incredibly important for education because then, you can't have 18 different narratives when you have a school atlas with people who are 11 and 12 sitting in a classroom. There has to be some kind of approved version.
How do you think this GPS changed all the history of cartography?
There's a great book written about this by William Rankin. I'll give you the reference. I'm not an expert on GPS, but Rankin is. He's amazing. And he's got his own website, Bill Rankin. But I think, obviously, Google changed the world. I don't think it's necessarily for the better. We are able to walk around with our smartphones and never get lost, but why shouldn't we get lost? Why is it a good thing to be able to find things? Thanks. Thank you.